Hi.
Hi, Jessica. How are you?
Sorry, I cut it very close.
No, that's okay. I was just telling everyone you're coming fresh off a TV appearance, so we would just give it a couple minutes. And I think we can still wait a little bit just as people kind of log on and gather.
And then everybody's wondering, why doesn't she look better if she just came off a TV appearance?
Stop.
Hardly.
Okay, so perfect. I see there's some people already signed on. Adam, thanks for doing this again.
Yes, I know. We between these speaking engagements and my classes that you've kindly agreed to talk to, we get to interact quite a bit.
A
good fortune.
I have to admit, I do love being with your students so much. You're very lucky.
Thank you. Yes, I am very fortunate.
And they're very lucky in turn.
Very kind to say so.
And they ask great questions. I mean, really, it's really a treat. I'm not kidding.
It's a thoughtful group. It's a thoughtful group.
Okay, I'm going to minimize this a little bit. I am very tempted to just turn it over to Q&A pretty quickly.
Well, that's
No
fine
worries.
with us. I'll just go ahead and start our intros. Oops. I think we have nearly reached kind of a critical mass.
It's totally up to you.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and we can dive in. Well, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. While I'm doing introductions, if you'd like to just drop in the chat, maybe say hello, where you're joining us from. And if you do change the setting to panelists and attendees, then everyone can see everyone else's chat and maybe connect with some former classmates or friends. So go ahead and drop that there. But for those of you who don't know me, I'm Megan Bernstein. I am Marlborough's Alumni Engagement Manager, and I am so excited to welcome you to our second ever Aiming High event. To say the subject matter of tonight's talk feels timely seems like an outrageous understatement, and I am so grateful to Jessica Levinson, class of 1998, for joining us tonight. Tonight's Aiming High also kicks off Marlborough's celebration of International Day of the Girl Child. This is a globally recognized day celebrated on October 11th, which aims to shine a spotlight on education inequalities and gender-based violence that girls face across the planet. And it's meant to sort of shine that spotlight in order to take some meaningful steps to remedy these very serious and often upsetting issues. This year, the theme of International Day of the Girl is My Voice, Our Equal Future. And what better way for all of us to use our voices than to get out and vote? And so I'm very happy to see all of you here tonight to learn more about voting rights and election law from our bona fide expert. As Jessica sort of alluded to, she'll be taking questions maybe in just a bit. So please feel free to put those questions in the Q&A box, which should appear just at the bottom of your Zoom window. It is an icon that quite literally says Q&A. And I'll be monitoring the chat as well as that Q&A for any technical or logistical questions. But I'm very thankful to have another member of the Marlborough community moderating tonight's talk and the Q&A. So it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Adam Torsen. He is Marlborough's debate program head, and this semester is teaching an upper school elective on presidential elections. He also holds a JD from Hamline University School of Law. And Mr. Torsen, I will let you take it from here.
Very good. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to start by introducing our distinguished speaker, Jessica Levinson, Marlborough class of 1998, studies the law of the political process, including election law and governance issues. Her work focuses on ethics, political corruption, voting rights, campaign finance, ballot initiatives, redistricting, term limits, and state budgets. So you will not be surprised that she is a popular speaker at the moment. Levinson regularly appears as a legal and political expert on television and radio and in print. She's the host of a new podcast called Passing Judgment and has a weekly legal segment on NPR member station in Los Angeles, KCRW. She's also an op-ed contributor to NBC.com. She served as the president of the Los Angeles Ethics Commission until 2018, a commodity which is at the moment in short supply. So we'll be excited to hear about that as well. And she is the founding director of Loyola Law School's Public Service Institute, which is dedicated to creating the next generation of leaders in government service. She's also the associate director of Loyola's Journalist Law School. And in her clearly very limited spare time, we have been fortunate enough to host her at Marlborough several times for talks with students and alumni. We're very grateful to welcome her again this evening. Professor Levinson, welcome.
Thank you. I do hope that you'll call me Jessica, though. And thank you for, oh, you know what? I see my husband with a glass of water. So I'm just going to grab that for 1 second.
Good. Well done.
Thank you. Welcome to what my class is now like. It's always such a treat to come speak at Marlborough in any form. And I always, as Megan knows, basically asked to come back to speak. So thank you for having me. We certainly, I do have a prepared speech on voting rights, and I can talk about it briefly, but I'm probably most interested in doing Q&A. I think maybe I'll say like 4 minutes worth of what I'm going to teach actually voting rights to my undergrads tonight from 6:30 to 9:30. So maybe I'll put those 3 hours into a couple of minutes, which is basically what voting rights. So the right to vote isn't actually in the original Constitution at all. And the right to vote first appears, as Adam knows, because he's an attorney and he's studied this, in the 14th Amendment. And basically all it says in the 14th Amendment is states you're going to be punished if you don't let citizens vote. And then in the 15th Amendment, the 19th Amendment, and the 26th Amendment, there's similar prohibitions that say, like, you don't get to tell people that they can't vote because they're Black or because they're a member of a language minority or because they're a woman, the 26th Amendment. And so we really see it in a way where it kind of almost appears like a black hole. You can't see the black hole, but you can observe things around it. And so we know there's a right to vote because people are saying, don't infringe on it. But there's no moment in either the original Constitution or the amendments to the Constitution that says, and here's your right to vote. And that's why, in a lot of ways, people talk about the right to vote as a privilege. And in some ways, we kind of treat it as such. We do, of course, infringe on the right to vote. We do so in some ways because we say it prevents fraud, most of which I think is totally overblown, or we think it prevents abuse. But we infringe on the right to vote, like we say, first you have to register before you can vote. We say that you have to go to a specific polling place. There's now a case that is before the Supreme Court this term, and I certainly hope we'll talk about the Supreme Court, that deals with whether or not Arizona has two policies that infringe on the right to vote. And the question is that okay? One of the policies says they won't count your vote if you cast it outside of your precinct. The other policy says that nobody can return your ballot unless they're a member of your household, your family, or your caretaker. So that's all a long way of saying we didn't really have robust protection for the right to vote until 1965. This is the landmark Civil Rights Act. LBJ, as president, signs this, and it has two key provisions. The first is Section 2, and it basically says you can't create voting laws that are discriminatory on the basis of race or being a language minority. And the idea is that there were states that were creating laws that made it more difficult, mainly for African Americans to vote. And then there's Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And what that says is, this is really unique among federal legislation. What Section 5 says is, there are some states or counties or cities, and they have such a bad history of voter discrimination that if they want to make any change, if they want to change where the polling place is, what their ballot looks like, how they draw their district lines, they have to check in with the federal government first. And I'll fast forward decades. We no longer have Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. The Supreme Court essentially declared that inoperable in 2013 in a case called Shelby County. As a side note, the dissent in Shelby County is probably known to many of you because this is when Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg famously said, throwing out Section 5 is like throwing out an umbrella in the middle of a rainstorm because you're still dry, which is, of course, a line that is on T-shirts and mugs and face masks, I think, throughout the country right now. And so right now, what we have is, how can we protect your right to vote? We have Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, and we have the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, that says you can't discriminate on the basis of race. There are also voting rights laws state by state. In some states, there's legislation and constitutional protections. I could say about 2 hours and 50 minutes more, but Adam, do you want me to stop for a little bit? What does the Q&A look like?
So far we don't have a lot of
Nothing,
but maybe we'll let the attendees know that this would be a good time to start throwing out your questions to Jessica. And in the meantime, I can fill in the gap with a couple of questions, or you can continue with your remarks. It's up to you.
So this, I'll just mention one. I'm happy to go into a lot more detail on like the history of the right to vote, the Supreme Court cases dealing with one person, one vote. Again, recent litigation dealing with voting rights, whether or not voter fraud is a real issue. Spoiler alert, it's not. But one of the two things that I've been asked about a lot over the last week or so, I thought I might talk about briefly. One is, in terms of voting laws and specifically ballots, what happens, and certainly nobody wishes the president that this happens, but what happens if the president passes away at this moment? So let me say, this is the murkiest possible moment in election law if you have a president who's incapacitated or passes away, by which I mean a president who's a presidential candidate. So I should have started by saying there's two issues with incapacity. One is that the president is an incumbent president. The other is that he's a candidate. So with respect to the fact that he's a candidate, it's really the weirdest possible time because ballots have already been printed. Over 2 million people have already voted. In California, I haven't gotten my ballot yet, but I think my neighbors have. I mean, people are filling out their ballots. People are already weighing in. It's way too late to pull back and reprint ballots. So what happens is that the national party, if it was the RNC, would basically name a new nominee, but say to everybody, if you want this new nominee, still go in and vote for the Trump-Pence slate. And then what would happen is on December 14th, when members of the Electoral College meet, and we can talk about the Electoral College in a lot more detail if you want, that they're basically, we have to believe that they are going to be party loyalists, which most of them are. And we have to believe that they will say, okay, we're casting our ballots for the new nominee if the state that I represent has voted for the Trump-Pence slate. That the idea is that members of the Electoral College will say, we know what you mean. You meant for me to vote for the Republican. This is the new Republican nominee, even though it's Trump-Pence on the ballot. You didn't, of course, mean Trump-Pence. You mean this new person. So that's the kind of ballot access issue. Separately, I've gotten a lot of questions this week about the 25th Amendment, which deals with presidential incapacity, among many other things. And so there's one really easy section of the 25th Amendment where the president says, I'm unable to serve. And for instance, think about George W. Bush getting a colonoscopy. He goes under general anesthesia. There's another letter waiting a few hours later that says, I'm okay, I can resume my duties. Section 4, which is a section that we've never used in American history, deals with involuntary incapacity. And in that case, what you would need is the vice president and a majority of the cabinet to go to Congress and say, we don't think that the president can serve. They have to go to the Senate pro tem and the Speaker of the House. At that point, the President of the United States can say, no, I'm okay. And what happens is both houses of Congress have to convene and meet within, I think, 48 hours and then vote within 21 days. And it would take 2/3 of them to vote to say, yes, the president is incapacitated. And then, depending on who loses, they can continue to play this process out over and over and over again. No, I don't think this is going to happen because Vice President Pence has been an enormous loyalist, and so has the cabinet. But that's the other way that you can remove President of the United States. With that, did I scare everyone into not asking a question?
No, not at all. Now we have several questions. So well done. You've whet everyone's appetite. I have to say, it never occurred to me to use imagine George W. Bush getting a colonoscopy to illustrate a constitutional law point before. Well done. Okay, so let's jump into the questions.
Okay.
Okay, so we've got a couple of questions about the significance of voting in person versus turning in ballots by hand. What are your thoughts about how important it is to, or how safe it is to mail in a ballot versus other methods of voting?
Yeah, so first of all, let me say, I'm not an epidemiologist, but I am fairly comfortable saying voting by mail is the safer option. Now, in LA, they have a number of, I just talked to the county registrar about this, they have a number of protocols in place to try and make it as safe as possible. It really depends on your risk assessment. Now, in terms of whether the vote by mail system is safe, I think almost everyone here is either LA or California. I would say I would feel very confident and very comfortable. There are always stories about mistakes. There are always stories that, some provisional ballots are not counted. There are always stories about signatures not matching. In California, the rules really try and make it so that if you have a situation where your ballot is maybe going to be tossed out, that you can say, no, that is my signature, that you have a chance to actually prove that that is you and that's your signature. That was probably too long a way of saying I really would feel totally comfortable voting by mail. I'm going to vote by mail. I obviously feel very strongly about the races this election. There are also, if you don't want to put something in the mail, there are, I think, 40 official drop boxes throughout the county. And Megan, I don't know if I should have tried to drop it into the chat or something, but you can find a drop box, if you want, like put your glove on, put it right in just like you would any other mail slot. And then it doesn't have to go through the postal service at all. And so I know that there's a lot of discussion about voter fraud, particularly through the vote by mail. It's really, really exceedingly rare. And the one thing I would say that people should be on alert for is the idea that because there's so much more vote by mail throughout the country, there could be something called a blue shift, so that on election night, it looks good for President Trump, but that as time goes by and more of the later vote by mail ballots are counted, that those are typically going to be for Biden, that those would be left leaning. And so it will look like things are shifting left. And President Trump is very likely to say, this shows fraud, this shows that the election is being stolen. In fact, this just shows that county registrars and state election administrators are doing what they should be doing, which is counting every ballot carefully.
Awesome. So another questioner, another attendee asks, I'm highly concerned about litigation following the election, especially in light of the fact that so many states are still in court and things seem to be changing by the hour. Do you share these concerns?
Yes, absolutely. Like if you're terrified, it's not irrational, I would say. I mean, I don't want to leave people with that, but I mean, I was just following on Twitter like an hour ago. There's breaking news from, I think, New Mexico and North Carolina. There's really heavy ongoing litigation every day dealing with things like, how long do you have from when you drop off your vote by mail for it to be received? If you have a postmark, does it have to be received within 3 days or 7 days? What if your ballot signature doesn't match the signature in the state database? Should you have an opportunity to say, no, let me sign again, this is my signature? Changing and reducing polling places. There is, I mean, really incredibly active litigation, whether or not COVID is an excuse such that you should get an absentee ballot. Now I'm completely blanking on the state that just today said the local GOP in the state sued and said, state, you cannot send an absentee ballot to every eligible voter, which is what's happening in California. So yes, enormous amount of litigation. And I think if we've seen anything over the last 7 months, it's that we cannot rely on the courts to quote unquote save us or protect us. And there are a lot of really smart lawyers working and litigating, but absolutely. I mean, everybody I think knows this is why the fights are so strenuous at this point, that this is really how you can win and lose elections is, people talk so much about, who's on the ballot and who's the nominee, but you can really win and lose elections by things like, is everybody going to be mailed an absentee ballot? Will we have, do you have to give an excuse for getting an absentee ballot? That can determine the outcome in a state, which might be a swing state.
Awesome. And sticking with the theme of ballot security and making sure that your vote counts, a questioner asks, is there a way to know if your ballot hasn't been accepted due to the kinds of issues you mentioned? For example, questioning the signature or clerical issues?
In California, you can check, yes. I think it's the Secretary of State's website, you can verify.
Perfect. All righty. So another questioner asked, with a patchwork of federal legislation that really does not set a national standard and with states limiting rights, why doesn't Congress create a new constitutional amendment to create a national standard of equal access to voting, regardless of gender, race, or language?
Well, or Congress doesn't actually even need to create a constitutional amendment. Constitutional amendments, of course, have to be passed by a supermajority of Congress and then the states, which is why it's incredibly difficult, and we have very few constitutional amendments throughout our nation's history. Congress absolutely could legislate in this area. So I talked briefly in the beginning about a 2013 case called Shelby County, which essentially eradicated Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Again, Section 5 said to some particularly bad actors, certain states, certain counties, certain cities, like, if you want to change anything about your voting laws, you really have to check in with us first. And so Congress could have said, you know what, we're going to change Section 5. And this isn't actually the Supreme Court's fault alone. This is also Congress's fault. Congress could legislate in this area. They could have done it. Remember, President Obama was in office until 2016. There was a president who was very willing to sign legislation that would have created much more protections on the federal level. Congress could create much more robust protections, not just reinstating Section 5, but just in general. Congress could could give a lot more guidance, with this caveat that Adam knows very well. Under the Constitution, it says states have the power to determine the time, place, and manner of elections. So states do still have a good deal of discretion, but it's clear to me that the federal government has supremacy in this area, can legislate in this area, and can say, here are some
floor protections. And states, you can do more if you want to. So that's really just a lack of political will on Congress's part. Adam, there's no reason this needs to be just me. You should certainly weigh in too.
Well, that you're kind to say so, but I will jump in should the opportunity present itself. But thus far, I bow to your superior wisdom.
No, I mean, people are going to get tired of hearing just me. Please, I mean, feel free to anytime.
Okay, thank you. I'll do that. Okay, so we've got a couple of questions about the voting system and possible reforms we might make to the voting system. I'm actually curious to hear your answer to this question because it is in fact the topic that our Marlboro debaters are debating right now. So a questioner asks, would the USA ever move towards a compulsory vote like New Zealand, where you can be fined up to $25 for non-voting?
No, because if we've learned anything from politicizing science, including whether or not you wear masks, is that Americans really love their liberty and their freedom and their hands off of our government telling you what to do. And I'm being a little too blunt force about this. I mean, we have a tradition of, I think, a libertarian tradition in our country. And so the idea of fining people to not vote, I think is not all that appealing, actually, even to some progressives or liberals. And frankly, not really even to me personally. I think that we should make it incredibly easy to vote. I think we can have things like automatic voter registration. But at a certain point, if you really don't want to weigh in, that is a decision. And again, assuming that barriers to entry are really low, then I don't want to pick somebody who doesn't want to take part in what kind of representative democracy we have and bring them, kicking and screaming and under threat of monetary penalty to the polls. But in our country, I just absolutely don't see it. Think about how much pushback there's been for, the individual mandate for healthcare, for everybody should wear a mask, for, anything that people feel is infringing on their liberties.
And I think the data backs you up on that. In fact, a student who graduated from Marlboro last year, who was also a debater, studied compulsory voting for her honors research topic. I bet this would be findable data on some Marlboro website, but her interest was, given that compulsory voting is wildly unpopular among adults, is it similarly unpopular among kids, or among young people, I should say, college-age kids and high school kids? And her finding was, yes, wildly unpopular. Okay, great. So sticking with the sort of election systems themes questions, a questioner asks, states like Utah have been doing almost fully mail-in voting for quite a long time. As an arguably incredibly red state, shouldn't that suggest to others that the mail-in voting process works? Why haven't more states shifted to this already, pandemic notwithstanding?
Yeah, so I think that this is going to be eventually the future. California passed like a law and some suggestions and some hopes and dreams a while ago, basically saying we should probably move to all vote by mail pretty soon because it's going to save us a lot of money. Now, Oregon has been all vote by mail for I don't know how long, and a number of other states that I'm blanking on have had situations where either like a special election has been all vote by mail, or they just are all vote by mail, period. And with very few issues of, there's no rampant corruption, no rampant voter fraud. It really is a safe way to vote. Now, I think part of it is that the people who make the rules, the people who would eliminate in-person voting, are people who tend to have voted in person and feel kind of sentimental about it and feel like it's a tradition and that maybe we shouldn't take this away, and that, it creates a kind of civic moment. I tend to think we're really moving away from that. And, by the time my daughter is like 7th grade, age, I wonder how many counties in California will still have polling places. So we've moved away from it a little bit. Now we have these big polling centers. And that's kind of part of the first step of getting people to be more comfortable with the idea of maybe you should just vote by mail or use a drop box. I had always said prior to 2016, you know, the big shift will be voting online. And now I feel that that's much further off than I very naively thought it was before because of cyber attacks and hacking. I still think that all of these kind of like same day voter registration and, you know, easy provisional voting and more early voting centers by universities, all of these things I think are kind of moving around the edges. The huge seismic shift will be voting online, but I don't see it right now.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. The Brennan Center has really good resources on this voter fraud question that you mentioned. So if anyone's looking to win an argument on the internet, that's a very good resource to deploy. Same theme, different topic areas. So another questioner asks, are many states looking closely at the Jim Crow era laws like we have here in California with Prop 17? Prop 17 is the proposition to allow folks on parole for a felony conviction to vote. The questioner says, I understand it was originally created to disenfranchise African Americans since there were more felons of color at the time, which is tragic. I'm curious about your take on this and if other states are reevaluating this law.
Yes, so I'm actually doing a panel on this, shameless plug, tomorrow with the UCLA Hammer Forum. And we have somebody from the Brennan Center who's going to be one of the panelists. And then the other panelist, I'm sorry, not tomorrow, Thursday. The other panelist will be, I think, a professor from the University of Virginia who studies voting rights. So the answer is that some states are looking at it. California tends to be at the forefront of these issues. And I'm going to close the door in a second. My suspicion is that if California passes Prop 17, then other states may try and similarly adopt these rules because it does disproportionately affect African Americans. The idea that the harder it is to get your voting rights back, the greater the impact on African Americans. And every state has a slightly different way of regaining your voting rights. California actually has a comparatively generous way, but this would just be an additional step. I will say that, you know, blue, progressive, liberal California, we tend to still be a little, kind of law and order for lack of a better way of describing it. So I don't remember the last polling for this. If you look up the PPIC, Public Policy Institute of California polls, I think they have a poll from the September 9th to September 13th week. And IG from the Institute for Governmental Service, IGS at Berkeley, also has polling. I'm not terrifically optimistic that it's going to pass, but a lot of the ballot measures, of course, depend on, you know, voter turnout from the top of the ticket. I don't think that really gave a full answer to the question because it's a really important question, but there's a lot of movement in the states. I mean, states like Florida, as I'm sure the person who asked knows, Florida tried to give former felons the right to vote back. The legislature tried to clarify it by saying you have to pay all of your fines and penalties first. That's currently in litigation as to whether or not that's permissible. Feel free to Q&A back if that didn't really answer your question.
Yes. So I think we have one more theme at the moment, or one more question themed on the sort of voting system. And that question is, do you think that if the United States were to abolish the Electoral College, would there be any unforeseen or unintended consequences? And what are your thoughts on that?
It depends on what your intentions are. Like, isn't that everybody's least favorite lawyerly answer? So the Electoral College, I mean, the simplest, so first of all, I think everybody knows what the Electoral College is. We don't actually vote for president on November 3rd. We vote for a slate of electors. Every state has the number of electors that equals the number of federal representatives they have. So in California, we have 53 members of Congress plus 2 federal senators. In California, I think it takes like 7.8 people more to pick one elector than it does in Wyoming. And the numbers are similar for like Rhode Island, Maine, because when you add in those 2 federal senators, it creates much, much more voting power for small states. So in practice, what the Electoral College does is it creates much more power for small, normally less diverse, normally more conservative states. And this is why I think Democrats going forward are very likely to win almost every national popular vote, but may not fare particularly well in the Electoral College. So, you know, the consequences of moving to national popular vote is that so now presidential candidates spend an enormous amount of time talking to swing state voters. That would change, and presidential candidates would go to like heavily populated suburban areas. So people in sparsely populated areas, people in more rural areas would feel like, why am I being completely forgotten here? It could mean that it's more expensive to campaign. So it could actually increase the influence of money in politics because those very populated areas tend to be very expensive when it comes to TV ad buys. You know, I don't really know how to answer unintended consequences because I'm not sure what the intention is, but it's not a clean, you know, there's no cons, but it absolutely does seem to me at this point to be somewhat ludicrous that it takes me to get like 7 of my friends together and all vote for the same person. And that gets us 1 elector in California versus, you know, my cousin in Wyoming just has to bring, let's say, herself, and she gets to pick her 1 elector. That kind of disproportionality just doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
It's interesting. I'm persuaded too by the Electoral College actually disenfranchises a lot of rural voters in blue states. So in the Central Valley, there are 5 million Californians who live in a relatively rural region. That's 10 times the population of North Dakota. So, then those folks' votes are essentially meaningless in the presidential election because California is going to go blue. So I do think that rural voters maybe could find a way to get behind Electoral College reform also.
I like that idea.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, so we've got a couple of questions about states and the role of states in elections. So one questioner asks, can you explain the role of state electors?
State electors?
State electors is the question. I think we mean like electors to the Electoral College, maybe.
So so briefly, and whoever asked, please chat back if this doesn't answer your question. You know, as we said, sorry, the chats are popping up. So in every state, you go to vote, and in every state but Maine and Nebraska, in the Electoral College, we have a winner-take-all system. So what that means is that if Joe Biden wins California, let's say he wins 99% of the votes, he gets 55 electors. Let's say he wins 50.001% of the votes, he gets 55 electors. And that totally changes how we campaign. It totally changes how much really kind of every vote is worth, in the sense that, you know, that's how you win in the national popular vote, right? You get so many more votes than you need in some big blue states, for instance. So what happens is, once we have decided the election state by state, which might take much longer than usual this time around, then the electors meet on December 14th. And what happens is that slate, whether or not we elected the Republican slate of electors or the Democratic slate of electors, goes and casts their ballot for the president and vice president that the state they represent voted for. Now, there was just litigation last term, I was going to say last semester, in the Supreme Court about whether or not states could punish electors if they weren't loyal, meaning if they said, I know that you, California, voted for Joe Biden, but I'm a big Mitt Romney fan. I think I'm going to vote for Mitt Romney. And what the Supreme Court said is, yes, it's okay to punish electors for going rogue. So that's the role of the electors. They tend to be really party loyalists, and so they don't go rogue very often. They've never changed the outcome of a presidential election. I mean, the kind of question is, why do we have the Electoral College at all? And I'm sure Adam knows this better than I do. I mean, so what I know is, in part, it was a last minute compromise by people who wanted more power for the states. In part, it's a relic of providing Southern white states with more power. And in part, it was supposed to be like a fail-safe to save us from ourselves. The idea being, you know, we vote for an unskilled, inexperienced demagogue, and the Electoral College says, no, people, you've really got it wrong. We'll go ahead and save you from yourselves.
Very good. I just want to alert folks that we're getting quite a few questions now, which is great, but don't worry if you haven't heard your question yet, or it's been a few minutes. We're working through them here, but just so you know, we're not ignoring you, I promise. Okay, so on that issue of some states might take longer to count their ballots this election, or to get a final result this election. A questioner asked, which states do you foresee having the greatest issues in this election? And by which I think we mean issues like counting the votes.
God, that's a great question. You know, I'm going to give this like really Weasley answer, which is, it kind of depends on what happens to the election, the really active, it really depends on what's happening when the active litigation over the next few weeks. So I think that will determine, you know, whether or not you can, for instance, cite COVID as an excuse to get an absentee ballot. Could solve a lot of litigation about, I didn't get my ballot on time because I had to wait and then give another excuse. You know, the most litigation is going to happen in the states where it could turn the outcome. So I think that's kind of another probably somewhat dissatisfying answer for you, which is, I don't think there's going to be a lot of litigation in California. I don't think there's going to be a lot of litigation in Alabama or Arkansas. But also remember that this litigation, this pre-election litigation, it doesn't just affect the presidential election. There's also fighting to make sure that people can weigh in on all the down ballot races too.
Great.
I just want to jump in and be mindful of Jessica's time, since I know she has class in a bit. So please, Jessica, tell us when you need to excuse yourself to sign off.
Probably like 6:28, so I don't have to have my husband bring me the second cup of water for my 3-hour class.
Okay, perfect. Well, I'm gonna combine a few questions because I think that they are similar. We've got several questions about the Supreme Court and the nomination of Judge Barrett. So a questioner asked, can you talk about voting on important things like a SCOTUS nominee in an election year and the moral issues Congress faces? Do we think that the rush to confirm that nominee points to a sense of panic in the GOP? We also have questions about court packing. How likely do we think it is for the response to the situation to be the next president adding additional Supreme Court seats? And I'll throw it in because I think these are all related to each other. Does Judge Barrett's confirmation, should it come to pass, cause a legitimacy crisis for the court? And should she recuse herself from election-related cases? So sorry, that's about 4 different questions, but all surrounding the same idea.
I'm gonna keep forgetting. So then I'll say, Adam, what did I not say?
Okay, I'll bring it back. Yeah.
Okay, good. So this is what I'll say about Judge Barrett's confirmation. Remember February 2016, Justice Antonin Scalia passes away. It's 9.5 months before the election. And the then and now leader of the Senate, Mitch McConnell, a Republican from Kentucky, says, we will not fill this seat in an election year. The people of the United States have to choose the next person who will choose the next Supreme Court justice. And President Obama nominates Merrick Garland, and he holds that seat open. And there's no confirmation hearings. There's no meetings with Merrick Garland. And fast forward to September 14th, 2020, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg passes away. What was it, 58 minutes after she passes away, Mitch McConnell says, we're going to fill that seat. Now, what he has said is that the difference is that there's a Republican-controlled Senate and now a Republican in the White House. I mean, to me, just say we want to fill the seat because it's really, really important to us. But that is not a legal distinction. It's not a constitutional distinction. The argument they're making is that the people of the United States sent a message when state by state, they all basically called each other and said, you know what, if we make sure that Republicans control the Senate, since we have a Republican in the White House, then we're sending a message that now we shouldn't wait in case there's a vacancy in an election year. I'll reiterate that it's not an election year. We're in an election. When Justice Ginsburg passed away, people were already voting. So I actually think that the President of the United States should be able to fill the vacancy whenever it comes up in his or her term, because the Constitution doesn't say, you know, you're president for 3 years when it comes to judicial appointments, but for 4 years for everything else. So I don't have a problem with President Trump filling the seat other than the just rank hypocrisy of Senate Republicans saying, we're not filling Justice Scalia's seat for 9.5 months. You just have to kind of pick a lane. And if our rule is just always, it doesn't matter if it happens the day before the election day, if it doesn't matter if the vacancy happens in a lame duck session, then that's fine. That's what the Constitution envisions, that presidents have the power to fill vacancies. Now, I think that, we could do hours on this, but Senate Republicans and Republicans in general have been really, really good about confirming judges. So the judicial branch has completely changed under President Trump. He has nominated and gotten confirmed a record number of judges. It will totally reshape our country for decades to come. And if you're a conservative, that's fantastic news. Now, I think that the Republicans have in many ways stayed with President Trump because of that, because they've said, okay, maybe you don't like what he says or the way he says it, but look at the judiciary, look at what's happening to the judiciary. And getting Judge Barrett on the Supreme Court, I think would be kind of the final moment of, see, it was worth it. We have a 6-3 conservative majority. So, excuse me, I think that's why there's this huge push to confirm her. Adam, you asked about the legitimacy. I mean, the Supreme Court doesn't have a military behind it. So the whole, magic is that when they write something, we say it has the force of law. And if we say, you know what, they're just political actors, they're just politicians in robes. And no, I don't think so. I know you said that, Supreme Court, but I'm over it. Then we have that is a constitutional crisis, right? Our Constitution is set up with a system with 3 co-equal branches. I don't know about how much it's going to harm the legitimacy. I think that, and then the question of, should she recuse? I actually don't think so, because it just assumes that then we might as well just say, we really don't trust you to ever judge. And I understand that it's like, the timing is super awkward because he just said, you're my nominee. And then she might have to weigh in and say, and you get to, or you don't get to be president. But if we can't trust her to be a judge on that issue, I don't think can trust her to be a judge on anything then, because everything has significant repercussions, and she might frankly care much more deeply about issues that affect reproductive rights or religious rights. So I don't think that she will agree to recuse herself. And I don't necessarily think that she should, which I know is a very unpopular view. And then court packing. So I don't think it's going to happen because President Trump certainly won't do it. And if Joe Biden is elected, he doesn't have an appetite for it. Court packing, we really just mean expanding the number of people who are on the Supreme Court. I would just say, excuse me, sorry. We should be a little careful about this because I think Democrats feel like they're stolen seats now. And I completely understand that. And I totally understand that. But if you add seats without other reforms, all it means is that at a certain point, there'll be a Republican president. And then he might or she might have even more seats to fill. So I just see that as a short-term fix that doesn't really get at what we're trying to solve.
Okay, excellent. We could ask a number of questions about that too, couldn't we? As you say, it's a many hours long topic, but I want to make sure we get some other folks' questions in on different topics. So another questioner asks, is it even remotely possible that elections could be run without the allowance of huge monetary donations and the solicitation of such funds?
Sure. Other countries do it. We could have public Adam, I think we've talked about this before in one of your classes, right? We did. That was our first class of their campaign finance.
Yes, we had pushing perspectives on that last spring.
Oh my God, 100,000 years ago. That was not in person though, right?
That was not in person. No, we were. Okay. We in fact we had to delay it because we were figuring out how.
Right. So sure, we could create a system of public financing where if you get a certain number of small donations or a certain number of signatures and we decide you're viable, then you get money from the government and that's all you can spend. Or we could say that you're limited in how much money you could spend in elections. And so there's no point in asking for more donations because you can only spend a certain amount. The Supreme Court back in 1976 said, well, but when you give money and when you spend money, that's speech and you can't restrict speech. But I think the short version is, I think that's wrong. I think money is money and speech is speech. And that's, 26 hours of my seminar in basically a too trite saying, but yeah, absolutely. You could. That's just not going to happen in our country anytime soon.
A questioner asks, is there an establishment of a citizenship requirement for voting? So I think that means, do you have to be a U.S. citizen to vote in U.S. elections?
Yes, you do have to be a citizen to vote. Okay.
How about someone asks about, a questioner asks, I wonder if we've outgrown the two-party system. Are there other governmental models that result in a more stable and arguably democratic voting outcome?
Oh, so more stable, I don't know, because every time I hear about like a parliamentary system with multiple political parties, it's like, and then this government collapsed. So I know we're recording, but kind of the somewhat secret is I actually never took a political science class. So I don't really know the answer to that question. I'm a lawyer who likes politics. Adam, I'm sure you know more than I do. Well, I don't know if they're more stable systems.
So usually people argue that stability is an advantage of a two-party system because those parties are big tents and it forces compromise internally. The theory behind like multi-party democracies is that it forces compromise among the parties. The challenge is that sometimes that doesn't work. So a good example in recent times have been Israeli elections, right?
Right.
There are a number of different parties arrayed on the left and right, and they just can't come together to form a successful coalition, or weren't able to for 3 rounds of elections. So I think that if the question is what's more democratic, you might be able to make an argument for a multi-party democracy, allowing people to cast ballots for parties that more closely represent their particular points of view. But I think that from a stability perspective, a two-party system, most people would say two parties is more stable. But there also aren't that many two-party democracies, right? So I guess it would be hard to have a big data set to demonstrate that. Okay, so we're doing pretty well. We've got, probably have time for one more question. So a questioner asks, in your opinion, what are the top 3 most important issues upon which the presidential election will hinge?
What, I knew that was coming. Hold on. So can you repeat the question, please?
Oh, yes. What are the top 3 issues upon which the presidential election is likely to hinge, in your opinion?
Oh my God. There's so, I feel like the way I would have answered this was different before the president got COVID, then it was different before the debate, then it was different before Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away. I mean, so people really do vote based on the economy. And so if there's something huge that happens either way with respect to the economy, I think people understand the pandemic. And so I think it will hinge on that, the economy, the pandemic, and then it's going to hinge on voting laws and how many people. I think it's going to be thin margins in some states and how many people actually get to show up.
Yeah. Interesting. Very good. All right, we're at 6:28.
I was going to say, I think we're just about out of time, but I really, really want to thank both of you for all of your time this evening. I certainly learned something more than a few things, and I hope everyone else did as well. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And I couldn't let everyone go without plugging our next Aiming High, which will be on November 10th at 6 p.m. With the Honorable Kimberly Baker Guillemette, class of 96, who is a Los Angeles Superior Court judge, and the Honorable Dorothy C. Kim, class of 1990, who is an Associate Justice on the California Court of Appeals. So I hope you'll join us for that. And thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Megan. I'm gonna abruptly leave, but I hope I'll see you both soon.
Yes,
Okay,
me too.
thank you.
Thank you both. Good night, everybody.
Bye.